Listen, the United States government in 1936 hired hundreds of people, writers, journalists, men and women who couldn't make rent, and sent them out to record old people. Not just old people. People born in the 1840s, the 1850s. People who remembered a world before railroads crossed every state, before electricity was ordinary, before cities grew from nothing into something unrecognizable inside a single lifetime. The project was called the Federal Writers Project. It ran from 1936 to 1939, and in 3 years, they collected, I've checked this 3 times, approximately 2,900 documented interviews, 24 states. Voices ranging from former slaves to frontier settlers to people who had watched, with their own eyes, half the American continent get built from scratch. The Library of Congress has most of it, has had it for decades, sitting there, cataloged, accessible, and here's what gets me. Almost nobody read it. I don't mean that in the dramatic sense. I mean it literally. These interviews sat in archive boxes for nearly 40 years before historians started treating them as primary sources in any serious way. 40 years during which the people who could have been asked follow-up questions were dying, one by one, taking with them whatever the typed transcripts didn't catch. The hesitations, the things they started to say and then didn't, the looks on their faces when certain years came up. The project didn't happen because someone in Washington had a sudden respect for oral history. It happened because it was 1936, the Depression was grinding through its 7th year, and the government needed to employ writers. That was the original logic. Give them something to do. Send them out with notebooks. The fact that what they captured turned out to be irreplaceable. That part was almost accidental. What they were trying to catch was a generation that had lived through a specific window of American history that would never exist again. People who remembered the country before the Civil War. People who had watched Reconstruction fail in real time. People who had seen technologies appear, the telegraph, the telephone, electric light, not as gradual background noise, but as sudden disorienting ruptures in daily life. One woman interviewed in Georgia in 1938 had been born in 1851. Think about that. She was born 6 years before the Dred Scott decision. She was still alive when Hitler invaded Poland. Her name was Mary Kelly. The interview is 8 pages long. She talks about her childhood, about the texture of daily life in a small southern town before the war, about things she cooked and songs she heard, and what certain buildings look like that no longer exist. And then, near the end, she says something that the interviewer notes with a single bracketed observation. Subject became emotional and declined to continue on this topic. We don't know what the topic was. The interviewer moved on. The transcript ends 2 paragraphs later with standard closing remarks. That bracketed note is the thing I keep coming back to, because here's what the Federal Writers Project was. At its core, a last attempt to catch something before it disappeared. And even with all that effort, the funding, the writers, the notebooks, the 24 states, they still got there too late for some of it. The interviews stop mid-sentence. Subjects decline to continue. Interviewers move on. The archive is full of doors that open halfway and then stick. 2,900 voices. And we don't yet know fully what they were trying to tell us, because the work of actually reading all of it systematically, treating it as the primary historical record it is, has barely begun. Which brings me to what some of those voices remembered, specifically what they remembered about one particular night. If you're still here and somehow holding it together, subscribe, because we go this deep every single week. Now, October 8th, 1871. Most people, if they know that date at all, know it as the night of the Great Chicago Fire. Mrs. O'Leary's cow, the famous story. A barn on the west side, a lantern, a city built mostly of wood that burned for 2 days and killed approximately 300 people. It's in every American history textbook. It has a mythology. Here's what the textbooks don't usually mention. On the same night, at approximately the same hour, the town of Holland, Michigan was burning, and Manistee, Michigan, and most catastrophically, a place called Peshtigo, Wisconsin, the Peshtigo Fire. I want you to hold that name. On the night of October 8th, 1871, a firestorm hit Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and the surrounding region with a speed and intensity that eyewitness accounts collected and published by Father Peter Pernin in 1874, a Catholic priest who survived, describe in terms that don't fit the standard model of how forest fires behave. Pernin's account, The Great Peshtigo Fire, an eyewitness account, is a real document. It's been digitized. You can read it. And what it describes is this. The fire did not approach. It arrived. There was a sound. Survivors described it variously as a roar, as a freight train, as something with no equivalent. And then the fire was everywhere simultaneously, not spreading from a point of origin the way fire spread, present, all at once. Pernin describes people running into the Peshtigo River to survive and watching the fire move across the surface of the water. He describes the air itself being on fire, not metaphorically, but in the sense that people in open clearings, away from trees, with nothing flammable near them, were dying. The death toll at Peshtigo was somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 people. The range exists because entire communities were gone. There was no one left to count. The Chicago fire killed approximately 300 people and destroyed a major American city. It got the headlines. Peshtigo killed somewhere between 5 and 8 times as many people on the same night. And it was a footnote by the following week. Chicago was a city. Peshtigo was a lumber town. That's the whole explanation for the coverage disparity. That's it. Now, here's what I want you to sit with. 3 separate fires in 3 states on the same night, within hours of each other. The National Weather Service historical records confirm the date. Researchers have noted this coincidence for decades. The standard explanation is a drought. 1871 was an exceptionally dry year across the upper Midwest, combined with the logging industry's practice of leaving enormous quantities of dried/wood across the forest floor. That explanation is plausible. It's probably substantially correct. But here's where it gets complicated. Some researchers, and I want to be clear, this is a minority scientific position, not a consensus, have proposed that the simultaneous ignitions across such a wide geographic area might be consistent with fragmented comet debris entering the atmosphere. Specifically, the Biela's comet hypothesis, which has been published in peer-reviewed form, including a 2004 paper in Earth, Moon, and Planets by researchers Robert Wood and D. Harrington. They're not cranks. They did the math, the atmospheric entry angle, the timing, the geographic distribution. It's not impossible. The mainstream position is still the drought and the slash. And that's fine. But here's the detail that doesn't go away, regardless of which explanation is correct. The people who survived Peshtigo described something. They described it in specific, consistent, independent terms. Father Pernin wrote it down in 1874, and for most of the 20th century, those descriptions sat in archives, available, cataloged, largely unread, while the history books kept running the Chicago cow story. The witnesses told us what they saw. We just weren't asking the right questions of what they left behind, and that, it turns out, is a pattern. In 1890, the United States Census Bureau conducted its decennial count and recorded 62.9 million names. Every person, every household, occupations, ages, birthplaces, the names of parents, the most complete demographic record the country had ever assembled. For the first time in census history, there was only one copy. I want to say that again. 62.9 million names. One copy. Previous censuses had been distributed across states, stored in multiple locations as a matter of basic institutional practice. In 1890, for reasons that census historians have documented but never fully explained, the records were consolidated in a single storage facility in Washington, D.C., one location, one set of documents. On January 10th, 1921, a fire broke out in the Commerce Department building where the 1890 census was stored. The fire was contained relatively quickly, but the water damage and the smoke damage destroyed an estimated 25% of the records outright. The remaining 75% were damaged to varying degrees. Some were salvageable, most were not. And here is the part that doesn't get included in the summary. The surviving documents sat in that damaged state for 12 years, from 1921 to 1933, 12 years during which the water damage, smoke damaged, partially destroyed records of 62.9 million people could theoretically have been stabilized, preserved, microfilmed, using technology that existed at the time. Microfilm was commercially available by the 1920s. The Library of Congress was already using it. They didn't do that. On February 21st, 1933, the acting Secretary of Commerce signed an authorization for the destruction of the remaining 1890 census records. Authorized destruction. That's the bureaucratic phrase. What it means is they took what was left of the documents recording 62.9 million Americans and disposed of them. The following day, February 22nd, 1933, President Hoover laid the cornerstone of the National Archives building. I'm not making an argument. I'm giving you the chronology. You can verify every date I just said through the Bureau of Census historical records and the National Archives' own institutional history. The sequence is documented. What you do with that sequence is your own business. What, somehow, is not the worst part of this story, because running parallel to the census, and this is the part that gets genuinely difficult to sit with, was a practice that had been ongoing since 1854 and continued until 1929. The Children's Aid Society of New York, founded by Charles Loring Brace, ran what became known as the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 children, most of them from New York City, many of them immigrants or the children of immigrants, were placed on trains and sent to rural families across the Midwest and the South. The stated goal was humanitarian. Get children out of urban poverty, place them with farming families who needed labor and could provide homes. Some of those placements were genuinely good. Some of those children found families that loved them and built full lives. But here's what the Children's Aid Society records, now held at the New York Public Library and partially digitized, show. The documentation was inconsistent at best. Names were changed. Origins were obscured. Siblings were separated. Children arrived in communities with paperwork that was incomplete, inaccurate, or simply lost. And when researchers in the late 20th century began trying to reconstruct what had happened, trying to find descendants, trying to map the placements, they kept running into the same wall. The records that would have answered the questions had not been preserved with any systematic care. 250,000 children, and for a significant portion of them, the paper trail ends at a train platform in the 1870s or 1880s or 1890s. So, the census that would have anchored those identities, destroyed. The records of where the children went, incomplete. And the generation that remembered any of this firsthand, dying in the 1930s, while the Federal Writers Project was racing to catch as many voices as it could before the window closed. That's not a theory. That's just what happened in sequence, with sources attached to every step. In 1893, the city of Chicago built a World's Fair, the world's Columbian Exposition, and at the center of it was something called the White City, a collection of temporary exhibition buildings designed by some of the most prominent architects in America, including Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted. More than 200 structures on 690 acres along the Lake Michigan shoreline, constructed in under 2 years. 2 years. 200 buildings. Some of them were enormous. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building was, at the time of its construction, the largest building in the world by square footage. 62,000 people could fit inside it simultaneously. It had its own internal rail system. They built it in under 2 years. And then, when the fair closed in October 1893, they tore almost all of it down. Some burned, some were demolished. The site was cleared, and the generation of Americans who had actually attended the exposition, who had walked through the White City and seen what it looked like when it was standing, carried that memory forward into the 20th century without any particular sense that it would matter later. It was a fair. You went. You came home. Life continued, but the women and men interviewed by the Federal Writers Project in the late 1930s, who had been born in the 1840s and 1850s, who remembered not just the White City, but the decades before it, the texture of American life before industrialization reshaped everything. Those people were trying to explain something to their grandchildren that their grandchildren could not quite receive. There's a woman in the WPA interviews, recorded in Illinois in 1938. She was born in the mid-1850s. The interview doesn't give her birthday precisely, but the interviewer notes she was in her early 80s. She talks about the fair. She talks about the buildings. And then she says something that the transcript captures almost in passing. She says she remembers when the landscape along the lake looked different. Before the fair, before the construction, she describes features of the shoreline that no longer exist. The interviewer, who was probably in his 30s, writes a brief note in the margin. Unclear what subject is referring to. Possible confusion with earlier period. Possible confusion. She was 80-something years old, describing something she had seen with her own eyes 60 years earlier. And the assumption was confusion. That's the thing about the last witnesses. They weren't confused. They were specific. They used precise language about what they had seen in the way that people who actually saw something used language, as opposed to people who read about it later. The specificity is in the record. The 2,900 interviews in the Library of Congress are full of it. Full of precise, consistent, grounded descriptions of things that the interviewer couldn't quite place because the interviewer had only known the world as it already was. The Federal Writers Project ended in 1939, not because the work was finished, because the funding was cut. Congress decided the program had communist sympathies, which, to be fair, some of the writers did have, and the money dried up. The interviews stopped. The remaining voices that hadn't been caught went uncaught. By the mid-1950s, most of the people who had been born before 1860 were gone. Mary Kelly, born 1851, died in 1964. One of the last documented individuals born before the Civil War, tracked by the Gerontological Research Group in their supercentenarian records. She outlived the project that had interviewed her by 25 years. There was no one to go back and ask what was behind that bracketed note. Subject became emotional and declined to continue on this topic. Whatever it was, it went with her. Here's what I want you to take from this. The archive is not empty. The The Library of Congress has 2,900 voices that have been there for 80 years, partially read, mostly accessible to anyone with an internet connection and enough patience to navigate a finding aid. The National Weather Service historical records are public. The Bureau of Census documentation of the 1890 destruction is public. Father Pernan's 1874 account of Peshtigo is digitized. The Children's Aid Society records are at the New York Public Library. None of this is hidden. That's the part that stays with me. Not that it was buried, but that it was left in plain sight, in boxes and microfilm reels and digitized PDFs, waiting for someone to sit down and actually read all of it, systematically, with the right questions. The last witnesses did their part. They showed up for the interviews. They talked for hours. They told the people with the notebooks what they remembered, including the things that made them emotional, including the things they eventually declined to continue on. We have the transcripts. We have the dates. We have the records of what was destroyed and when and on whose authorization. What we haven't fully done yet is read it like it matters. Before I close this particular drawer, tell me in the comments, which part of this hit you hardest? Because there's more in here, a lot more.